mission. Brad Pomerance on the Central Coast, joined by John Ashbaugh, councilman from San Luis Obispo, also a history professor and global studies professor at Hancock College, and now an author, a writer. He published in this magazine, we can call it a magazine, La Vista, put out by the History Center of San Luis Obispo County. And you talked about the visits of two presidents to the city. Only two have visited. Who?
Well, the first one was actually 1901. It was William McKinley. He had been elected originally in 1896, re-elected in 1900, so just a year earlier, actually a few months earlier.
Right.
And his new vice president for his second term was a man named Theodore Roosevelt, and he was the second. And they both came by train. The train was only completed in 1894 to San Luis Obispo, and 1900 before it connected from San Luis Obispo all the way to LA. So they were still on a kind of shakedown cruise.
Right.
But
so let's talk about Theodore Roosevelt, because your article focuses upon his historic visit to the city of San Luis Obispo, which at the time had 3,000 residents. The county had 20,000 residents. That's in your article. How many people showed up to his visit?
About 10,000 people.
That's amazing.
Estimated. Yeah, half the county at least. And there were special excursion trains to San Luis Obispo offering special rates from all over the Central Coast to come see him.
And what I love about your article is what's the historical term? First-hand accounts? Or
Yes, there's a first-person account.
First-person accounts. You have found statements written by people who were there.
Yes,
who were actually there at the time. And I love the description, I think it was of Mrs. Anne L. Morrison.
Annie Morrison.
She was a school teacher, mother of four, and she talked about how once he arrived, there was a hush. No one said anything. Why?
Well, the secretary for Theodore Roosevelt had sent word ahead of time to all the locations, and he actually gave 255 visits over 10 weeks, 14,000 miles. I don't know how he had the stamina or energy, except everybody commented about how Theodore Roosevelt was like an Energizer bunny. He couldn't keep the guy down. So a woman named Annie Morrison is in the crowd, and like everybody else, she has learned from the president's secretary that there should be no fireworks, no firearms, no loud noises, anything like that, because it was only a year earlier that William McKinley had been shot in
that's the
assassination threat, terrorism. It was an anarchist, in fact, and so she steps out from the curb and she waves her hat and she says, "3 cheers for Roosevelt!" And the crowd erupts, and the president puts on his big toothy grin, and he lifts his hat to her as he's being escorted on a caravan down to Monterey Street, down to the mission. And then he tours the mission.
And that's significant, because the mission, as we know, a significant part of California history.
Absolutely.
Father Sarah set it up in 1772, and here we have an American president touring this mission.
And it was in disrepair at the time, but he was, it wasn't actually remodeled until much later. And they, in 1920s, that's another story we'll get into the next time we talk.
For sure.
But the mission, after the mission, he goes back into the car and he goes over to what is now Mitchell Park, just a couple blocks from the main High Garrett Street there. It was called Murphy Block at the time. And Mitchell Park, he gives a 15-minute speech. And just from his heart, we have a record of it, that we have exactly what he said then. And a large part of it is this conservation message that he'd been kind of developing and honing over
And let's talk about that, because this trip, known as it's the Great Loop, historians believe that this is when Theodore Roosevelt developed his passion for the environment. He's considered the great environmental president.
Absolutely.
And it happened on this trip, which included a visit to San Luis Obispo.
Yes, and he visited, first of all, Yellowstone National Park. He spent about a week or so there with a famed naturalist named John Burroughs.
Sure.
And he made sure to spend time in Yosemite National Park with John Muir. There's a very famous photograph of him at Glacier Point. So, and he was himself a naturalist. He, from the smallest age, he had a little menagerie, and he had a taxidermy operation going in their home on West 54th Street in New York City.
And I understand he also visited the Grand Canyon.
That's where things really,
And that's what you talked about in the article.
And he didn't have enough time this time. So he actually came back several years later, but he only lived 10 years after this. So, well, no, see, 1903, 1919, so he lived 16 years, but 10 years after he left the presidency in 1909.
But even when he was at the Grand Canyon, he was so moved by the majesty of it. Yeah. When he went to Yosemite, you write about how he was angry when he saw signs nailed into the trees.
The what is now called the Roosevelt Grove.
Right.
Although you have to know where to find it because there's no sign there at all. And he asked, they had signs on all the trees. This is the tin can tree. This is the General Sherman tree and so on. And he asked that the signs, he said, this is a desecration of this. This is a sacred grove. And then he asked for a few minutes just to walk among the redwoods by himself. And while he did, the same secretary, William Loeb, asked the crowd very quietly, let's go out and pull those signs down.
Amazing, amazing.
And they did, and there hasn't been a sign there ever since. It's the Roosevelt Grove in the Pogonip area, actually in Santa Cruz, and just up above the city. Yeah.
And as a result of the impact this trip had on him, when he returned to Washington, what did he do? What legislation did he champion that resulted in really the fabric of our nation changing to this day?
Well, he did a number of things to establish national forests, national parks, wildlife refuges, as they're called today. They were game refuges then, all over the country. All told, over the course of his presidency, he saved 260 million acres of land throughout
No
the
one's done
continent.
that since.
Nobody ever could anymore. The continent is much too crowded these days. But,
what's so interesting is Theodore Roosevelt, a Republican, is seen as the father of the environmental movement, the father of conservation. I do believe Richard Nixon was the father of the EPA, is that right?
He was, and Nixon was one of those environmentally oriented presidents. George Bush as well really talked about his environmental work. He was attacked for not being enough of an environmentalist, but he defended himself. These days, it's a different story.
It is a different story. The parties at some level, without casting any positive or negative statements, have flipped.
Absolutely.
I think it's fair to say the Democrats now are more interested in conservation.
Yeah, the only strong environmental legislation is coming from California legislators, Democrats like Barbara Boxer, Dianne Feinstein, who protected a vast area of the desert in her first term as our senator. She's stepping down at the end of this year, of course. But no, it's Barbara Boxer who's stepping down, sorry.
Yes.
But yeah, it is Democrats who are championing the cause of environmental regulation and preservation. Lois Capps, our local member of Congress.
Who's stepping down.
Yeah.
Let's talk about your desire to remember that moment.
Yes.
You are spearheading an effort to do what?
Well, I'd like to put a statue in place in Mitchell Park of Theodore Roosevelt. We have an artist who's already lined up, a woman named Paula Zima, who's very well known locally. She did the grizzly bear in Mission Plaza. So everybody knows the grizzly bear and the Chumash child and the leaping salmon and the little pond right in front of the Mission. So Paula saw the fact that I had committed to do this article 2 years ago, and she wrote to me immediately and said, hey, I'd love to do this sculpture. What do you think?
But think about the fact that John Ashbaugh, a well-known Democrat in San Luis Obispo, is spearheading the effort to honor a Republican president.
And you know what? I've talked to the environmental, the head of the Republican Central Committee, a gentleman named Colonel Al Fonzi up in Atascadero. And I said, I want to do this as a kind of a bipartisan thing, and I'd really like to have a statue of Theodore Roosevelt in Mitchell Park. And as soon as I said the words Theodore Roosevelt, his eyes just lit up.
He was pleased.
Yeah, I said, I've just been reading a book about this guy. You know, so yeah.
Hopefully you'll come back and tell us whether the statue becomes a reality.
It's moving ahead. We're going to be starting to raise money in just a few weeks.
His name is John Ashbaugh. I'm Brad Pomerance, Charter Local Edition.